Online? Okay, so now let's get started, now that we're recording. And let's go around the room and introduce ourselves. We're starting with Saudi.
Yeah, Saudi, Ahmed Saudi. I am a Muslim. I'm from Islamic Center of Minnesota.
I am Hafiz Mahmoud, and I am Muslim, and I'm the co-chair of Interfaith group here in the Islamic Center of Minnesota.
I'm Bon Clayton, the Christian co-chair, and I'm a member of Colonial Church of Edina, which is a congregational church.
Henry Gunnick, I'm a retired Christian pastor. My congregation was in Inver Grove Heights, Grace Christian Reformed Church in Inver Grove Heights. So,
I'm Sean Thompson. I'm a Muslim and a teacher at As-Sufa Academy.
Wait, what are we just introducing?
Introductions.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm Sarah Thompson, and I'm Muslim. And
Okay, you're related to some other Thompsons?
oh yeah, I'm his daughter.
Okay.
Sorry, I should have said that. I'm his daughter.
Okay.
And I'm Adam Reingans. I am a Christian. I go to Centennial United Methodist Church in St. Paul.
Okay, and then Steve?
I'm Steve McMichael. I'm Roman Catholic, happen to be a Roman Catholic priest and a Franciscan friar, not a monk, but a friar. And I teach at the University of St. Thomas, and I help out at various churches around the area.
Okay, so are there any others online? I can't really be sure.
No,
Okay.
Steve is the only one today.
Okay, so let's get right into it then. We have the topic of asceticism, which I think plays an important role in both religions in one way or another. And the Christian presenter is always first by tradition in our group. So the Christian presenter is Steve.
Okay, well, I decided I'm not going to read my presentation here. I'm going to do kind of an ad lib thing because I find it a little more life-giving. If I read notes in class at St. Thomas, I would be thrown out, I think. And the students wouldn't show up. So I just want to begin with, this, we're talking about this asceticism as like an exercise and a training thing. I'd like to really begin with the discipleship of those Christians who are following Jesus, and especially because at least in the Roman Catholic tradition, we're now reading through the Gospel of Mark, and Mark's Gospel is very much about being an itinerant, following Jesus in this, as Jesus was an itinerant preacher. It's the life of the road, and so part of this is the life of being a disciple of Jesus was following and following in that sense of being a preacher. And what discipleship meant in the Gospel of Mark was about picking up your own cross and following me. And so as I mention, or I remind my students of this, Mark is written, probably recorded in the 60s, and this is when a lot of persecution is happening in the church, especially from the Romans. This is when most of the first followers of Jesus have died. So part of this theme of martyrdom comes in. But part of this thing is that discipleship meant this following of Jesus. And so asceticism, in a sense, is doing everything you can to be able to have the freedom to follow Jesus. And part of this thing was, of course, embracing suffering, because the community is being persecuted. There's suffering that is happening. And so part of this, part of the gospel presentation of this is basically, if you're going to be a follower of Jesus, especially in the first couple centuries, you're risking your life in the sense of being called in by Romans to do sacrifice. And if you refuse to do that, you would be martyred. And part of this thing was the discipleship of Jesus meant that basically that I'm going to suffer. And then when we, and I have my students actually read the whole Gospel of Luke during the semester, because Luke is very much centered on Jesus as prophet, about Jesus being the example of taking care of those people the less fortunate. I think this is what ties in, as I tell my students at St. Thomas, this is where I think a common ground is in the world, from the world of Christianity to the world of Islam, because it's Jesus is ministering to those people who we would consider to be less fortunate. We would call them the poor. This is where you would enter into the lives of others, and especially those people like widows, orphans, the sick, the lepers, people being persecuted. It would be the more vulnerable people in the society. And so part of the Gospel of Luke is reminding them, if you're going to be a follower of Jesus, then you actually do these works of mercy and compassion, especially compassion, meaning suffering with. And so asceticism in this sense, and I think in the Gospel of Luke, would be basically of doing that self-denial that I need to kind of empty myself, so that I have the freedom and the ability to embrace those people around me, especially those people who are suffering. This is where I think asceticism and compassion come in. It's a sense of, I just don't suffer just for the sake of suffering. It's when I'm entering the lives of other people, especially the poor and the vulnerable, and that I am entering into their lives, and therefore I'm going to suffer with them. And that's what compassion means. So I see in the Gospels, there's a focus here of asceticism, is meaning that I expect that life is going to bring me suffering, and I'm going to suffer for the sake of, in Mark's Gospel, would be the cross. But for Luke's Gospel, there's a shift moreover to the sense of, if I'm going to be a merciful, compassionate person, then I'm going to have to do those ascetical sorts of things, of a self-denial, to be able to give my total self to others. So this is what I think is really where the Gospels come in. Paul uses this language of asceticism. I just want to, sorry, I've got my other screen here with other things. Paul speaks about these things in terms of also of imitating what Jesus is doing in that. And then he speaks of being an athlete, or being somebody who is in a fight and so forth, and the training ground. And it's really means of striving for the goal of being this follower of Jesus. And so much of Western Christianity is influenced up until the time of the Reformation by monasticism. And monasticism, the earliest monks were not people who actually were in a monastery, like we find at St. John's, for example, the Benedictines, but it was actually, the earliest monks were actually hermits who went out in Egypt and Syria and various other places. They went out into the desert. And so we have this history of the desert fathers and mothers who went out to the desert. In order to survive the desert environment, they practiced these things of asceticism. And so these monks, as I have down here, they would practice these forms of mortification, we would say, of fasting, long periods of prayer. They would be doing this in a sort of a solitary environment. And so it was more of victory over, they had more of a sense of, it's a victory over oneself, of our own evil desires, our own wants, and all those various things. And so they would do this in a solitary thing. And so you have asceticism here of, really, it's about surviving the desert, but it's also in that solitary environment of having a place where union with God was the sort of absolute goal. And so everything they do in terms of asceticism is to arrive at that state of union with God. And then we go into Western monasticism with what is called the cenobitical and not the eremitical, and that is the life of people in a community. And so asceticism in the Benedictine rule is basically about living in a communal environment, having surviving with one another and so forth, and doing those practices which were also found in the desert. And I have a list of those things that, like self-flagellation. This becomes even more popular in the later Middle Ages, and maybe I'll have a chance to talk about that. Wakefulness, genuflection, as a penitential robes, fasting, especially total charity. These are these ascetical practices that became basically the way of monasticism. But then it went into, as the mendicants come in, and these are Franciscans, Dominicans, and so forth, who are, we would call mendicant. We were beggar, we were religious communities formed around the idea of a renunciation in terms of about poverty, also of connecting up with humility. But all of this, the mendicants come out of the late 12th, early 13th centuries and pervade the spirituality of Western Europe for up until the Reformation. Much of this was centered on focusing on not necessarily the divinity of Jesus, but it's more of the humanity, because they're reading these texts, like especially the Gospel of Luke, they're looking at the Gospel of Mark, they're looking at this, and they're trying to live what they call the apostolic life, meaning that I'm going to be living like those apostles, which they understood to be these wandering preachers. And that's why poverty. And so when they focused on the humanity of Jesus, they were focusing in on the humility and poverty of Jesus. And so their lives had to reflect that poverty. In fact, this is what the Franciscans were known for. It's basically of not having any ownership of anything, nothing you can claim as mine. You know, this is what I always mention in class when I'm talking about this. What is one of the first things a child learns? Mine. You know, it's like, I want to have possession of this. In the Franciscan perspective, everything that we have, even our own being, is a gift. And therefore we give everything as a gift to us, we give that away. And so this is part of asceticism.
Steve, I wonder if we could stop for just a minute during the call to prayer and Zoom.
Okay, sure. Okay, so this towards as we move towards the Reformation, and maybe this is not so known within the Islamic community because there's a whole different time dimensions that we have. But during the Reformation, when Christianity goes through its various changes and upheavals, the up until that point, the kind of standard way of asceticism was basically doing these practices that fit into the what is called the mystic way, and that is basically of going from purgation to illumination to union. This becomes sort of the standard way of viewing the life of spirituality, the spiritual journey. And so the purgative was this emphasis that was there on basically removing all of those things in my own life, even my own desires, objects, possessions, all of those things, to sort of empty myself out for the sake of this, of being filled with grace and then moving into union with God. And so these practices of long periods of prayer, of fasting, they would do these things of flagellation. This is beating your back. This is sort of like representing what Jesus went through before the crucifixion, when he was basically tortured by the Romans. It's doing those practices that, and some of these things got very into the various extreme, that it was basically what people were trying to do is, in terms of asceticism, is training the body so that it completely is emptied out and so it can be filled. And this is what illumination meant, the second stage, which led to the final stage of union with God. And that was the ultimate aim of the spiritual journey. And so when we get to, this is sort of this, the way asceticism operated all the way until the Reformation. And then when you come to the Reformation, when you have the development of Lutherans and various other reform groups are coming, the Calvinists, and people were following Zwingli, and even what was going on in England. This is when all of these monastic practices sort of got laid aside and reevaluated. And I'm not sure. The only ones that I can think of that would kind of resemble in this sort of more medieval sense are the Amish. Because the Amish try to live very, they're in a very, what we consider to be very primitive way of living without electricity for the most part, of living like you were living back in the 18th century. The way they dress, the way they live their life is more of a sort of an ascetical approach to that. I'm not sure what happens in other areas of, for example, Lutherans, Methodists, and so forth, where asceticism fits in. I'm more familiar because I'm a medievalist in a Franciscan mendicant. This is the area that I know in terms of the ascetical practice is basically of following this path of going from purgation to illumination to union. There are people, I know there are people in this group that are from other traditions within Christianity. I hope that they have a chance to say something, but this is what I have to offer today.
Okay, thank you very much. John?
So I'd like to start off by offering an apology of sorts. I put this together rather hastily. Things in my life as a teacher have become hectic as of late, so I didn't have the time that I wanted to work on this. But I'll try to add some things here and there as I go through it. So I started off with defining terms, as I usually do when I do anything like this. And so the word asceticism comes from ascetic as an adjective and the suffix ism. And ascetic, as Steve mentioned, is basically related to exercise and training of an athlete. And so this took on a similar meaning in religious circles in the sense of training the inner self, or what we would call in Arabic the nafs, get translated as self, ego. Sometimes it's translated as soul, but it's really exercising and a training for that. Then I'll skip over the ism part. In Arabic, the word for asceticism is zuhd, and it's really a very good translation because the Arabic word zuhd really means the same thing. They both have very similar roots. The English word asceticism and the Arabic word zuhd in the sense of exercise and training and things of that sort. So asceticism as a practice is an art in the sense of exercising or training. Asceticism as a practice in an art or in the sense of exercising or training is a religious self-denial. It renders the Arabic word zuhd and is an apropos translation. It has been seen throughout history in various forms, including, but not exclusive to, the Stoics, Jews, Christians, Buddhists, and as this paper will demonstrate, Muslims. Well, I provided a few verses from the Qur'an that mention this idea of asceticism. And the first one is, O mankind, beware your Lord, and dread a fearful day when no parent shall avail their child, nor any child ever born avail their parent the slightest. Verily, the promise of Allah is truth. So let not the pathetic life of this world deceive you, nor let the deceiver play you false with words about the mildness of Allah. So I highlighted the words here, so let not the pathetic life of this world deceive you, because this is at the core of what's behind asceticism. The idea that this life is temporal, and it's a temporary life, and it's as we'll see in one of the hadith, it's seen as something that we should shun for the most part. And there's another verse here, nor is the pathetic life of this world, but a frivolity and gain. And verily the final abode, it alone is the life that is vibrantly forever alive, did they but know. So again, we have the life of this world described as being pathetic, and it's also described as being a frivolity and a gain. It's just a playtime for most people. And then there are a few hadith that I've also provided here. Renounce the worldly life, which is called dunya in Arabic, and Allah will love you. As for people, leave it. Leave the dunya to them, and they will love you. So the idea here is that if you leave the world alone, you leave worldly possessions be. You don't focus yourself on acquiring worldly possessions, then God will love you. And if you leave that to other people, then people will love you. People will love and respect and admire you because you are not a worldly person, because you're not a person who tries to accumulate all these worldly possessions. And then leave the world, the dunya, to its people. Whoever takes from the world more than what suffices him, he has taken a portion of his ruin while he is unaware. So again, this idea of leaving worldly possessions, and the Prophet said, leave it to its people. And he said, whoever takes from the world more than what suffices him. So there is a certain amount of worldly possessions that we need to survive. Excuse me, and that is really what suffices us. There's another hadith in which the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said in summary that we will be judged for anything more than dry bread and water. That's enough to keep the body alive. And so whatever we take in more than that, we will be judged for that. And then finally, verily, the food of the son of Adam presents a parable for the worldly life, in what the son of Adam defecates. He garnishes the food and seasons it, yet look at what it becomes. So this is the parable of this world. It's something that that it looks beautiful to us and entices us, just like a good food that is garnished, and we take time to prepare it and it's tasty. But at the end of it, the food we take the food in and we see what it comes out of us as. That's the same as this world. So the roots of asceticism in Islam is what I discuss next. So as with every valid science in Islam, and I've used the word science here in a more traditional sense in which it represents the idea of knowledge, not the idea of a scientific process. As with every valid science in Islam, asceticism has its roots in the want, the sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Historically, sciences originated with the Prophet Muhammad and later would acquire a specialized name given to it by scholars, and over time agreed upon names come to us. The technical name of this science is, according to most scholars, tasawwuf, while others have preferred the term tazkiyat an-nafs, purification of the self. Tasawwuf as a word and technical name has dubious origins, with various scholars proffering varying origins, ranging from a woolen garment worn by some ascetics to the porch that was attached to the masjid of the Prophet, where those who had fallen on hard times would reside and be fed and taught by the messenger of God. The various sciences in Islam, they all start with the Prophet Muhammad, and they acquire a technical sense and a technical name over time, and that's what has come to us in these days. So the science, like I said here, of this asceticism is tasawwuf or tazkiyat an-nafs. There are other sciences like tafsir, exegesis. The Prophet Muhammad gave commentary, exegesis of the Qur'an, and this was taken up by the scholars, and the process was refined and given a technical name, so on and so forth. And it's very similar with this science of tasawwuf or tazkiyat an-nafs. The word tasawwuf is what, like I said, has been used by most scholars. And like I said, the name we're unsure about where its actual origins are. But there was a kind of a porch. It was a raised and a flat area outside the mosque of the Prophet. And a lot of times new Muslims would come there, people who had just converted to Islam. A lot of times those people would be homeless because they had been kicked out by their families or something like that. And also people who had just fallen on hard times in general. They would reside there, and it was connected to the Mosque of the Prophet. So he would come there to teach them, as well as he would feed them and take care of them and other things. The Prophet, peace be upon him, in a somewhat lengthy hadith known as the Hadith of Gabriel, expounds what came to be the four dimensions of Islam: belief, jurisprudence, excellence, and eschatology. In this beautiful teaching of the angel Gabriel, the Prophet told us that ihsan, excellence, is to worship God as if you see him, or if you do not see him, he surely sees you. Each of these dimensions has a corresponding science in Islam, and the corresponding science for Islam is, that should be for ihsan. The corresponding science for ihsan is tasawwuf. The use of the first three of these dimensions became famous among scholars and their students, with scholars such as Abdul Wahid ibn Ashur saying at the beginning of his didactical poem, Al-Murshid al-Mu'in, after praising God, blessing the Prophet Muhammad, and supplicating God, on the subject of Aqidah, belief of Al-Ash'ari, the fiqh, jurisprudence of Malik, and the tariqah, the path of excellence of Junaid, the wayfarer. Imam Abu Muhammad Junaid al-Baghdadi, when most Muslim scholars fell either towards the legalistic tradition, jurisprudence, or the more spiritual tradition known as Sufism, tasawwuf, was known as the sheikh of the two camps because he was a master of both. So in this hadith of Gabriel, it talks about ihsan. And ihsan, I've translated it as excellence here. Some prefer to translate it as beautification. Really, the core of it is, as the Prophet answered, it is to worship God as if you see him. For if you do not see him, he surely sees you. And so this really should translate to all aspects of the Muslim's life, that they have a constant vigilance of God, and they know that if they don't see him, that he surely is seeing them, that he's surely watching them. And so with this idea of God constantly watching us, we were able to incorporate a sense of self-discipline, a sense of self-governance. We're able to govern ourselves and behave accordingly, as though we're in the presence of God in each and every aspect of our lives. So now I go on to talk about tasawwuf. The science of tasawwuf has been famously elucidated by another scholar of both jurisprudence and tasawwuf, Sidi Ahmed Zarruq al-Barnusi al-Fasi. In his Foundations of the Spiritual Path, he gives a concise exposition of this science. He explains that the foundations of the science are five. Taqwa, which is mindfulness of God, in both private and public. Adherence to the Sunnah, the want of the Prophet Muhammad, in word and deed. Indifference to whether others accept or reject one. Contentment with God in times of both hardship and ease, and turning to God in prosperity and adversity. So these are the five foundations of the practice of tasawwuf. Having mindfulness of God privately and publicly, adhering to the practice or the tradition of the Prophet Muhammad in both word and deed, and not caring about the acceptance or rejecting of other people, being content with God at all times in both hardship and ease, and turning to God in whatever state you find yourself in, whether it is prosperity or adversity. He then explicates these five, saying, the realization of mindfulness of God is through scrupulousness and uprightness. The realization of adherence to the Sunnah is through caution and excellent character. The realization of indifference to others' acceptance or rejection is through patience and trust in God. The realization of contentment is through acceptance of what one is given and turning over the management of one's affairs to God. And the realization of turning back to God is through praise and gratitude in times of prosperity and taking refuge in him in times of affliction. Now, this idea of the purification of the self, which I mentioned before, is another name that is sometimes used for the science instead of tasawwuf. It's taskiyat al-nafs, purification of the self. So purification of the self is often seen as being synonymous with tasawwuf, and in some usage it is. However, technically it is but one part of the science of tasawwuf. God mentions the self many times in the Qur'an, addressing it directly. In one famous passage, he swears by it, saying, and by lofty soul, the self or the nafs, and that which perfected it in matchless nature, and instilled in its sense of evil and God-fearingness. He has truly succeeded forever, who makes it reach full purity in faith and deed, and he has truly failed forever, who buries it in evil. So we have, in the Quran, God telling us about the soul, the nafs, and purifying it. And he says the successful are those who make it reach full purity in faith and deed. And those who fail in the next life are those who bury the self in evil. Imam al-Ghazali talks about the self and its purification at length in his magnum opus, Ihya Ulumuddin, the revival of the religious sciences. He defines the self, sometimes translated as soul, in two ways. One meaning, he says, according to the Sufis, the people of Tasawwuf, is that principle in man that includes his blameworthy qualities. So they say, the soul must be striven against and broken. This is alluded to by the Prophet, peace be upon him, in his statement, "Your soul, which is between your two sides, is your worst enemy." The other meaning, he says, is that subtle, tenuous substance that we have mentioned elsewhere in the Ihya Ulumuddin, which is in reality man. He writes about man and the various interactions of his faculties or elements. Of these are the heart, the spirit or soul, the self, ego or soul, and the intellect. And he mentions a particularly important interaction as the purification of the self being the profit of the intellect in its trade of purchasing felicity in the next life. Well, let me go on, sorry. As God says in the Qur'an, a day when wealth nor sons can avail, but rather only he who brings God a heart sound and pure. For Imam al-Ghazali, taking from Aristotle and Plato, the intellect is the governor of men, and it is the intellect, or that rational faculty within man, that should govern what he feels, thinks, does, and says. And it is by the intellect that the self is governed and reined in from its passions and desires running amok. So for Imam al-Ghazali and much of the people who practice this science, the intellect is part of what's called the tripartite soul. Taking, like I said, from Plato and Aristotle. You have the vegetative soul or the appetitive soul, which is full of desires and passions. It's what creates in us our desire to eat food. And then you have the emotive soul, which is related to the emotions. So we have courage, for example, as an emotion, as a passion that we use to do things when we need to do them, standing against or in the face of fear. And then we have the rational soul, or the rational faculty. And it is the job of the rational faculty in man to govern the two lower parts of the soul, the emotive part and the appetitive part, governing the emotions, controlling them when they need to be controlled, not letting emotions control us, and governing the desires and passions that we have, not succumbing to gluttony and things like that. So the intellect should be the governor of man, as he called it. So in conclusion, asceticism in Islam is a fundamental aspect of a larger science we have mentioned, Vidalicet Tasawwuf. It was fundamental in the want of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and is fundamental to the practice of purifying the self. In various other forms of asceticism, we see it as a withdrawal from people and the worldly life. Whereas in Islam, as can be gleaned from the above, the Muslim is expected to live an ascetic life internally while being of the world externally. The purification of the self is for God, not for people, and as such should be an internal practice. This is shown through the act of fasting. This is shown through the act of fasting in the month of Ramadan. And about fasting, God says, "Every deed of the son of Adam is for him, except for fasting. It is for me, and I will reward it." Fasting is an internal practice and would not be known to people save for the tongue expressing it. And God knows best.
Thank you. So, Steve, do you have any questions for Sean?
No, I don't. I think there's a lot of, I found there were a lot of similarities, because it seems like asceticism is very, very similar, especially with things of purification and non-attachment and so forth. I don't know what to say beyond that.
Okay, Sean, do you have any questions for Steve?
Don't have any questions, but I did want to comment on something. You talked about purgation, illumination, and communion, and this is very similar to the idea of purification of the self, which I didn't elucidate more. So when there's a process that the self will go through in this process of purification or refinement, where the goal was really to take on the qualities or the character of the Prophet Muhammad, who was seen as a reflection of the qualities of God, what we call the names of God. For example, you have like names such as Ar-Rahim, which means the merciful, which is a name of God. And the Prophet Muhammad was called Rahim by God. You also have the name Al-Adl, which means the just. And the Prophet, in his life, he demonstrated justice in all of his, all the things that he did. So taking on this character of the Prophet is part of or really the goal of this refinement or purification of the self, and culminating in there is a hadith Qudsi where so hadith Qudsi is said by the Prophet Muhammad, but it's him saying something that God said. So I'll paraphrase it. And so God says in this hadith Qudsi that the servant will draw near to me through his obligatory acts and his voluntary acts until I become the mouth with which he speaks, the hand with which he strikes, the foot with which he walks, and so on. Now, I'm paraphrasing. I'm leaving out some of it. But the idea there is that once the self has become refined to a point where it's taken on the character of the prophet, the light of God shines through, and it's as if God is controlling because the self has submitted to God in the fullest sense, and it's allowing the commandments of God to flow through it.
In Christianity, especially in Catholicism, the slogan "Imitatio Christi" is common. We Protestants like that too, I think. At least I do. I think many Protestants do. The idea of imitating Christ and what he does, what he did, what he thinks, what he is. I mean, the whole idea of imitating Muhammad seems to me to be parallel to that.
Yes.
And in fact, St. Paul uses the Greek phrase "mimitai theo," which means that we should imitate God. When we do that, that isn't the only way to do it, but one way to do it is to imitate Christ. So I see that's a parallel situation. Now, this is a really rich and challenging and broad-ranging thing because God is apophatic. He's transcendent. And so the closer we get to imitating God, the more we understand that we are looking from outside. And everything takes on a different nature, different meaning. The hand, the foot, everything. So it seems to me that
Definitely. Yeah.
Cody, what do you think?
Yeah, it's I look at it as like so, which even God means a person who is not interested in wearing fancy clothes.
What's the word again?
Zuhd.
Zuhd
is the word for asceticism.
Oh,
Arabic is zuhd.
Zuhd. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, a person who doesn't look for fancy clothes or fancy food or fancy car or fancy anything. Just anything will do. So he's not really pushing higher up. He's pushing for something just to get him.
Minimum needs.
Minimum
Living with
needs.
minimum needs.
Yes. And that's also it was meant that jihad in nafs. Strive against the inner self. And it's narrated by Abu Hurairah and that Messenger Muhammad والسلام, after opening, and that means people thought that it's over, no more fighting. So they said the goal was to open Mecca. And that Messenger Muhammad والسلام, said that is the end of the smaller jihad. And you are facing now the bigger jihad. And say, what's the bigger jihad? He said, jihad in nafs. That you strive until you to control your inner self, which is zuhd. And that's why the Sufis are, their main characteristics is zuhd. I mean, if they want to work, they work to get their minimal requirement, necessities. That's how they behave and they conduct their own life. And you can see that from the Mormons, you know, they are really, but the Sufis are not like the Mormons. They can still use electricity and stuff like that. But everything they look for is the meaning.
So how many Muslims would you say actually pursue that goal?
Yeah, lots of Muslims try to get by not buying or not acquiring expensive stuff like that. That is the people who do zuhd. And they spend most of their money on sadaqah, you know, for the poor and the needy. So whenever they have money, they spend it for sadaqah, charity, because charity is unlimited. And the benefit from it is momentous. It's very important. I mean, it's written in the Qur'an. But some people say, after they see what happened in the Day of Judgment, can I go back? If I go back, I'll do sadaqah. Of what the sadaqah impact on the people and how they are all rewarded. He didn't say to come back to pray or fast. Just want to go back to do sadaqah, charity, which is the benefits. The person can be good to his own society. When I pray for myself. When I fast, I do it for myself. When I do Hajj, I do Hajj for myself. But it's only sadaqah when I really benefit the society, benefit the poor and the needy, and everybody needs. So that's why one of the things also about sadaqah that Messenger Muhammad ﷺ said, when a person dies, his actions are done. Good deeds are over, except in 3 cases. That those sadaqatun jariyah, which means a continuous charity. Like you put money in the bank, investment, and whatever comes from the investment is spent on the poor and the needy, and it's done every year. So the money doesn't stop, doesn't end, and this is called continuous charity. And also the second one is promote knowledge or science that benefit the people. That's number 2. So everybody does this, practice this new knowledge or science that has been achieved. It's benefit for the person, still collecting good deeds. And the last one, good family children who are raised in a good way, that from time to time they look to the sky and say, oh Allah, have mercy on my father and mother for what they do.
About 20 years ago, we went around the room of one of these meetings, and everybody said what they what they appreciated most about Christianity if they were Muslims, or about Islam if they were Christians. And my response was, I appreciated the piety of Muslims. But thinking about it, it's more like Zuhd, because that's the beginning of piety. And for me, it's simplicity. I don't, the idea that you make believe for a second that there's nothing in the world, so what do I have to do with the world? And then you just do the least in certain areas. I mean, that doesn't mean you give up tzedakah, but you do, as you say, you don't buy the fanciest clothes, you don't get the fanciest food, and the fanciest car, and so forth. Now, so I think this is my impression of Islam. My major impression of Muslims, the first Khalifas, Omar and Uthman, were famous because they had zuhud.
Yes, they had to.
And this is not something you find in rulers or CEOs of companies. I mean, it's just not normal. It isn't something that we should say is impossible. It's not impossible, but it's not normal. And when you're looking at Christians, we usually use the word spiritual. In our church, or in any church where I've met Christians, we say that some people are more spiritual than others. And I think we're talking about zuhud, because they do things which are simple, like you said, like you described. And so that seems to me as part of the idea of imitating God, because God in the variables that exist in this world, He is simple. He is outside of the world, so his variable with respect to time and space is zero. He's there. So, what do you think?
Yeah, I see the similarities between Christianity and Islam about this. So, there's a lot of similarity to achieve asceticism or zuhud and purification of the self, and but I would like to point out there is some places where they don't exactly overlap. So when you look at the Christianity in them, the Zohod, when they acquire this, they go through monasticism and abstinence and approaches like Brother Steve mentioned in his presentation. They go to solitary confinements, go into the deserts and seclude themselves from the world totally. And but when you look at the Muslim historically and famous Muslim personalities like you just mentioned, Umar, he ran the world, he stayed in the world, yet he demonstrated how to achieve the zuhud. So, and there's another difference which I think probably is more dominant in Catholicism, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, not marrying.
Yeah, celibacy.
Right? Celibacy. In Islam, it's totally forbidden to believe that non-marrying is required. So, I mean, the Prophet ﷺ says, the best of you are those who are the best to their families. So, and there, he also said in one of the hadiths that there is no monasticism in Islam. It's in Musnad Ahmad. And
Well,
Wealth is not in having, okay, so wealth is not in having many possessions, but rather true wealth is feeling content with oneself. So, we are also not taught to not do business, not to earn livings. Just give up everything. We are not taught this. We are actually taught the opposite, to earn and live halal income and earn as much as you can, the halal income. And if once you earn more than what your needs, then remember you have the share of those who are less fortunate, and spend on those and spend in the way of Allah. So, and in this way you don't, uh, what is the word for israf? Don't go extravagant on that, on yourself, on income. You don't need to do that. So, and you can still like the examples of the first four caliphs. They had all the wealth of the whole Muslim world at their disposal, yet they will be living in one piece of cloth. And even in there's a famous story of Umar bin Khattab. He was the caliph, and there was a war booty that came, and in this there was pieces of cloth. They were distributed among the Muslims, and as a war booty. And when at the time of the sermon he was delivering on the Friday sermon on the pulpit, he was wearing two pieces himself, and he was caliph.
Yeah.
And the person sitting in front of him got angry and stood up. When everybody got one piece, how come you being the caliph and you took over two pieces? Yeah. He said, my son gifted me his piece because my body is a little bit larger, so it could not fit with one piece. So he donated his piece to me. So this is the kind of personality, and this is the kind of zohad he demonstrated by living. He was married, he has children, and it is said that he ruled like 2/3 of the known world at that time. That was his world, but he was living in this much minimum for himself.
One of the marks by which he was known when he went to Jerusalem. His impoverished lifestyle.
Yeah, when Jerusalem was taken over by Muslims, there was a siege that Muslim laid around the Jerusalem when the first Muslim took over, and then the Christians of the Jerusalem, they required that we will hand over the city only to the leader of the Muslims, not to the commanders, and so we need to talk to him first.
Yeah.
So the message was sent through whichever means of messages were there at that time, and then it reached to Medina, to Umar bin Khattab, and he went over with his servant, and on the way to the Jerusalem, he had one camel, and these were two, a servant and him. So they were taking turns. And at the time he reached Jerusalem, it was the servant's turn to be on the camel. And the servant said, it will not look fit for the kings to be walking the camel for the servant when we enter to interface with another nation or something. So he said, no, it is your turn, and you will be sitting there. And when we entered, the people over there, they started talking to the servant as if they thought he's a leader. Then he said, no, I am not the Amir. He is the one who's running my camel.
The two major differences, I think, in the scriptures would be celibacy and living entirely separate from the world. Now, this is not in Christian scriptures. This is not completely established. Catholics, well, St. Paul said it's okay to remain single. And obviously, if we're going to be imitating Christ, somebody would come up sooner or later with the idea that Christ never got married. So that's, Steve can say more about that, but there is a tendency among ascetics, monastics, who live completely away from the world and never come out of the desert. But that's pretty rare lately. And they all, the Catholics and the Orthodox, and some Anglicans that follow these monastic orders, are very dedicated to purity. So we Protestants would say that it isn't necessary for us to be celibate because we think the Bible doesn't tell us we have to be. And we certainly don't think that it's necessary for us to go up on the top of Mount Athos, which is a famous Orthodox seminary, monastery, and live there for the rest of our lives. But the practices, saying the Jesus prayer, fasting, and the simplicity that you're talking about, Saudi, Protestants think that that's a good thing. We don't have as many practitioners among Protestants as the Catholics and the Orthodox do. But those seem to be the two main differences, but the differences are not as stark as it seems to be the case when you read the Quran. Because the Quran says you should not be celibate and you should not live separate from the world. Steve, you want to say any more about that?
Well, no, I just think, it's, and this was the desert fathers and mothers, as I talked about, a phenomenon that's second to the 5th, 6th centuries. This is a, very minimal number of people that were actually called to that. The reason why we know a lot about them is they did writing. And so you have this literature that's around there. And then the monastic world, monastics have never, in terms of numbers of populations, were never, but for these Christians like myself, I felt that this was a special call from God that, but for me, it's not living alone. For me as a Franciscan, it's living in a community of brothers. Mm-hmm. So it's, and that's where practice of the celibacy comes in. It's that it's not expressed sexually, but it's expressed in, in various other ways. I once had actually a Muslim from Turkey in my class who says, you don't know anything about reality, because I was talking about living a celibate life. And she started talking about her experience of married life and stuff. And I said, wait a minute now, I do have that experience. I live in a community here. We don't share the intimacy that couples do, but we share so many other things. And this is where the mendicant, like Franciscans, Dominicans, and others, it's not the sense that we are called to aloneness or solitude. It's that we're called into community life, which the community life would be very difficult had it been, if there wasn't this call to live a celibate life. And I know that this is not a common thing among other religions, but it is found in Buddhism, for example. And maybe I'll just, I had, because some student raised a question about this, and it baffled me, but it's in this context of celibacy that we were talking about Mary in the Quran. And one of the students said, that as far as I know, there's no mention that she was ever married. That she gave birth, miraculously to Jesus through, like Adam was. And that's what the Quran states. But I've never heard anyone talk about Mary having any relationship that we would consider a married relationship, because according to the Islamic tradition, she spends her life in service of the temple. So my question is, is Mary one of those examples of her living a celibate life, or if I'm completely wrong about this?
I would say you're right about it. She is definitely depicted as being secluded, and even brought food. She didn't even go out to get her own food and things like that. It was brought to her. So she lived a very secluded lifestyle, and the practices in that time were definitely different. So, for example, there's also mentioned in the Qur'an in the same time period with Zechariah that God told him to fast from talking. That's not something that, I don't know of anybody that does it anymore. But it was definitely a practice at that time. So.
I went on a retreat where we fasted from talking.
Really?
Yeah,
Nice.
it was nice. It was quiet.
I've heard of retreats where they fast from social media, but
Yeah.
talking I haven't heard of.
Our church had one of those 60 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, here at the Franciscan Retreat Center in Prior Lake, we do have retreats that it is totally silent. I mean, they get talks, but they are not to talk among themselves. You don't talk at meals. And so the people come here, and it's very popular. They want to have this quiet time. I myself, I always feel strange at a meal of eating and not talking. It's, but those are, we do a number of those here. And it's just not social media. It's you don't talk. You're not supposed to talk to one another at all during this period of time. Now that can be 3 days. It could be 5 days. Some people go off and do like a 30-day retreat where they do not speak to anyone. It's
difficult.
Yeah, it's very difficult. It's like I said, I find it. I've been on a silent retreat, and I find it. During the day, it's not difficult. But when you're at meals, I always feel meals are social. So it's very difficult not to talk, but we have them here.
So Henry, what do you think?
Well, if you're talking about Protestants, maybe for some Christians, the only time they get anything close like this would be during Lent. Because then they feel that they need to pick something that they will deny themselves for 30 days or however long Lent lasts. But that's probably for some that today that's supposed to still get to it.
Yeah. Okay. Adam?
I think we do, in Christianity in general, I think everybody understands that, simple living or, giving as much as you can is definitely the good thing to do, whether people do it or not. I don't know. I think that, at least like in Methodism and Lutheran, with Martin Luther and John Wesley, the idea that there was a big idea of trying to go out and just working extremely hard, trying to make a lot of money so that you could have influence and be able to donate and things. I think that's a kind of strong message in some of those early sermons and stuff that they gave. But then, of course, there's the temptation, right? If I can make 10 times as much money, and then maybe even I can donate 10 times as much, but then I also am taking home 10 times as much or whatever, right? If I'm giving 10%, and I make $1 million and I give 10% of that, I make 20,000 a year and I give 10%. If I make $1 million in theory, I should be able to give more than 10%. Mm-hmm. So I think there's, I think we can, I think it's just a temptation for people, right? Of like, how much do you cut God in on this if you're being highly successful? So I think that's kind of how people look at it sometimes. So, I think there's kind of the asceticism then is sort of this extreme example. I guess like using Jesus as an example for Christians or Muhammad as an example for Muslims, right? You strive to live like that, even though you're never going to like be that good, but you have kind of an extreme example that you can look to as the
role models.
Yeah, as a role model. So I think, at least to me and Protestantism, we don't really have the ascetics who go out and live in the desert or anything. I'm sure we've had one or two, but it's not an established thing. But we do still kind of look at those folks with respect as being sort of an extreme example, right? It's like, well, if this guy can live in a cave for 20 years with nothing, then certainly I could probably get by in a smaller house or with less things, and I could, be giving more and prioritizing more time reading the Bible and praying and things because you have this example of, look what this guy was able to do.
Would you say that the idea of holiness and Methodism is at least pointing in the direction of simplicity and asceticism?
I would think so personally. I don't know if everyone would think so, but I mean, yeah, I think in general, it does point towards having less distractions, being more focused, trying to not accumulate all these good things for yourself. I think that's definitely part of Christianity as far as I would interpret it.
Right.
So yeah, I think a lot of like what you talked about with the asceticism, I mean, I think a lot of Christians do ascribe to that. Hopefully the majority of them ascribe to that. Maybe the point where we draw the line is different. I mean, I'm sure everybody draws it in a different spot, but yeah, I think we do have those ideas for sure.
Well, not marrying in Islam is not considered a symbol of holiness, but in Christianity, it looks like from our explanation, it
I
does
think
look
in
like a symbol of
Catholicism
holiness.
Protestantism, our pastors and everyone
Not
get
married
married.
for God.
Protestants and Catholics disagree on that.
I think there is definitely I think Protestants would agree. Some people probably shouldn't get married. I mean, if you really get a call from God that you need to go do something, I mean, some things you just can't have a family in tow. For I think 99.99% of people, though, I think, yeah, you can get married.
Well, I think the Quran
But that will be an excuse, not like a symbol of holiness.
Yeah, I think the not getting married in Protestantism, yeah, it's not considered a symbol of holiness. There's an understanding that you may have something you need to do that you just aren't going to be able to get married because you have this thing you need to accomplish. But you not getting married wouldn't be the holiness. You doing this thing would be the holiness.
It seems to me that the gospel, the New Testament, makes it possible for people to be unmarried. I mean, I'm Norwegian. I have a lot of great uncles and so forth that never got married, and aunts also, great aunts. And it seemed to be a kind of a tradition among Norwegian immigrants. I'm not sure why that was. I've never been able to figure it out. But in the Old Testament, in the Torah, there is a strong mandate from God to be fruitful, multiply. God wants you to have a lot of children.
Yeah, the same thing in Islam.
And that's the same thing in Islam, right? Yeah.
There is something, maybe somebody can correct me on that. I read somewhere that until 800 AD, Common Era, the Pope used to be married.
The what?
The Pope
was
married.
I think priests were able to get married. I don't know if the Pope was ever married.
Steve might know more about
that.
Well, I don't. There's examples of popes being married, but I think generally speaking, when you get into, I think the 5th, 6th centuries, that is no longer the case. That does not mean that popes didn't have mistresses and so like this, because we know certain ones during the later Middle Ages and early Renaissance fathered children. So but the expectation, I think, from about 500 onwards is that the Pope would be celibate, but not, it's like, actually mandatory celibacy for example, ministers or priests comes really in about the 11th and 12th centuries. where that becomes specifically, and then you'd have to see that in its medieval context of what that meant, because there are a lot of things socially happening that prevented that. And
Yeah, because at that time, when the Pope dies, his family, wife and children ask for inheritance. So the church decided later on that to be a Pope, you have to be celibate. So no children, nobody can inherit. No family can inherit any money from the church.
So is that the reason? It seems to me that
I want to be corrected on that.
No, I think actually it has more, well, that might be the case at certain times, but I think it's more of the sense of their own understanding of the life of Jesus. And they are reading, as Bon, I think, mentioned earlier, their understanding that Jesus himself lived a celibate life. And so they would understand being a follower of Jesus was that. And so that's where the mystique of celibacy comes in, because they're seeing this as this is Jesus, how Jesus lived himself. And so to be a disciple of Jesus, now that does not mean that people, even in the Middle Ages, consider themselves to be disciples of Jesus by being married. But there's a certain mystique of that.
It seems to me, Steve, that this transition that took place in the 6th century was influenced by the monastic movement.
Oh, yeah, very much so. Because you go into the feudal times, so you don't have urban, we call urban spirituality. You don't have a large towns. You don't have cities. This is, all the way up until like the 11th, 12th centuries. And they call it the 12th century Renaissance in Western Europe because it was a time in which cities were on the rise. So you have Paris and you have various, London and Canterbury, and even in Italy, you have these rise of these city states. And once you have an environment where you have a city, need for urban spirituality would come in. But that does not mean that monastic spirituality didn't influence that, because it's in a certain sense, they didn't have anything to fall back on. There was no spirituality really of the laity that really came into focus. That comes in more in the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries, which of course leads to the Reformation. It's one of those things that actually, one of the positive things of the later Middle Ages leads to, the formation of more of a spirituality that's not monastic, if that makes sense.
Another thing I've noticed is that not only are all Protestants not celibate, but that Orthodox are not also, just the Catholic priests.
Well, Orthodox, though, you have to be married before you are ordained, my understanding. And once if you were not married, then you cannot do that.
Well, what I've heard is that you can be married if you're a priest without any other requirement, but you can't be a bishop if you're married.
Well, I've always heard it that you have to be married first in order then to be ordained. If you're not, then I don't know. I'm going back in memory here, and
the thing I'm curious about is how far back does that go with regard to the Eastern Church? Was it true before 1054 when the Orthodox split from the Catholic?
Yeah, I don't know.
Okay. We had another person join us a few minutes ago, half an hour ago, Naim Qureshi. Naim, did you have any comments?
Well, I think both the Christians and the Muslim religion.
We can't hear you very well.
Can you hear me now?
Better.
Yes.
Yeah, I think both the religions are focused on bettering the humanity And I think that's the key thing that I take away from this discussion, that we want a humanity that's better than before. And that's our mission in life.
Mhm. Well, that's why just to add on, that's why I think it was so important in Western European spirituality that they really were focusing and not that they weren't denying the divinity of Jesus, but they were very much caught up into looking at Jesus as this human being that they were going to follow. So they found these examples, and the same thing with Mary. And
That's the bottom line that I see. What have you done for humanity lately is the question.
Mhm.
And both the Christian and the Muslim traditions point to that. There are several instances where Muslim and Christian leaders have shown humanity and humility in serving the public and making their life better than what it was before. And I think that's the message that I get from this interfaith discussion of today.
Mhm.
We are both
One more
focused
comment.
on making sure that we give back to humanity to make it better. And
You're talking about more, Naim, are you talking about more than tzedakah?
yeah, sadaqah and zakat in Islam
Zakat.
is important elements in that. And zakat is, as you probably know, is a certain percent of your income has to go to the public, for poor. And if we all follow that principle, there will be nobody on the street begging. We have enough wealth in this country, and it distresses me to see people standing in intersections and begging for money. We have the ability to take care of them and alleviate any problem that they have, but it's not happening. And that's the message that I want to take from this discussion is it's my and everybody else's duty to alleviate the suffering of the people that are around them.
Okay, thank you. Henry.
Yeah, one other thing I wanted to bring out is the motivation. Why would you do the fasting and things like that? And there have been times when the motivation comes out of kind of a dualism where the physical is seen as evil and the spiritual as good, and where the only thing that I saw in here somewhere was somebody looked at the body as kind of a donkey, and the donkey, and that could very easily, you discipline your body because you don't appreciate that it is actually okay. Physical is okay. God declared it was good when He made it. So you have to be aware, I think, of what's the motive behind why you are trying to discipline or deny yourself. That it isn't because of this dualism that physical is evil and the spiritual is good.
Well, it seems to me that the parallel is athletic activity, because that's also where the word comes from, because just doing any old thing with our body uh, is not what the goal of athletics is. We try to do specific things, and the Quran and the Bible tell us what those specific things are. The Quran and the Bible don't say anything about being a good football player, but that's not the point. But the athletic idea is still there. We train our habits and our minds to try to fast because God appreciates that. But that's like an athlete. We have to train our body to do that. This is something we just are able to do. And now Christians obviously don't fast very much, but Jesus makes it clear that when he leaves, we're going to fast. But so we should think about it more. Think about when we're going to fast. Fuller Seminary, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, had a program whereby they all of their students fasted during Ramadan, so they could better understand Islam. Well, what a great idea! You know, that's the way to understand God, but also a better way to understand how Muslims feel about God. So, but then in the Old Testament, we see that David called for fasts from time to time when there were really terrible things happening. And we don't have to wait for terrible things. We can have fasts to celebrate things that we want to have happen. So I just think we Protestants can do more, but it all comes down to training ourselves to do it.
David called for like national fast, didn't he? Like in an address to the people, I thought.
Yes, right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Kind
I
of a
think
unique
after
thing.
9/11, didn't we also call for that?
Did we, or was that a joke? I
No,
don't remember.
I think we did after
Oh.
9/12. See the idea of our wanting to be more friendly and unified at that point. Many of our churches, at least,
Oh, yeah.
also called for that.
Good idea.
So, Sean, do you have any final comments? We're getting close to 4 o'clock.
There's something that's been come up a few times in my mind that the conversation went in a different direction. But the real goal of asceticism in Islam is detachment from things of this world. And so there, along with that, there have been a whole spectrum of how that's been approached. There have been some people who, as I think Saudi was saying, who really lived a very minimal lifestyle. They sought to live a very minimal lifestyle, just barely sustaining themselves, just enough clothing, whatever. But then, and that was seen as Ahmed was talking about with the Khalifa Omar.
Yeah.
His lifestyle was like that.
Yeah.
But then there have been other people, such as Sheikh Abdul Qadir Jilani, or even amongst the companions of the Prophet, with the merchant.
Western
No,
Ibn Auf,
no, yeah, Abdurrahman.
Abdurrahman ibn Auf.
Yeah, he was a very wealthy merchant, but even though they were wealthy, Abdurrahman bin Auf was a companion of the Prophet, and Sheikh Abdul Qadir Jilani was also a very wealthy person. They didn't have any attachment to any of that wealth in their hearts. So the idea, like I said, is really an internal thing where you're internally detached from these things, even if outwardly you've been blessed with them.
Mhm. Yeah, I think it is possible. I think that the richest people, the most successful people, can develop that spirituality. I think it's less likely. It's a temptation to have power and success and money. But
This
it's
is what Allah says in the Quran. He tests you by taking away from you or by giving to you.
Yeah.
So both scenarios are a test for you. So, so when you got a lot of wealth, a lot of sustenance and provision and privileges in your life, then you have more temptations to attach to those things.
Mhm.
So if you successfully fight those temptations, keep yourself detached from those, that means you are basically passing the test.
Yeah.
There is also a verse on the Quran which say generally that those who accumulate treasures,
Count them and keep counting their life numbers.
yeah, and make treasures out of gold and silver, it will be hot in their tummies in the day after.
Yeah.
So that means it's nothing wrong in making good money. But the problem is when you start accumulating and you don't pay zakat or sadaqah and stuff like that. Zakat is a prescribed amount that you have to pay. But sadaqah is unlimited.
You can pay all of your money.
You can pay all of your money sadaqah.
Like the Prophet ﷺ, he used to empty his everything before going to bed every night.
I mean, when he died, he had only a mule. Messenger Muhammad had a mule, and his shield was put as a collateral for a debt that he acquired. Although he owned all of Arabia.
Yeah. So he ruled Arabia by the end of his life, and then yet he
Still in
empty
debt.
everything to the people before he goes to bed.
So he was an example to the Caliphs.
Yeah.
So the Prophet ﷺ also said, I mean, it's not in his teaching not to become rich. He says earn money and establish yourself in the businesses, but he says that it is hard for a rich person to enter paradise.
So
because his test is very temptation. It's extremely temptation.
I have to say that in our preaching, we don't talk about this idea enough. What about your preaching? How much is that mentioned in your Friday preaching?
Yeah, zakat money. You have part of the 5 pillars of Islam is paid zakat.
No, I'm talking about
It means
the simplicity.
in the khutbah.
So, go ahead.
Yeah, just live whatever you have. Don't extra spend money in a wasted way. Yeah. Don't waste money.
So is
In other words, we do. I mean, in khutbahs, we teach about spending on the poor and the needy
And the
and
needy.
Islamic institutions or things like that.
I would say it's
that teaching is definitely there.
it's talked about more and more contemporarily as a way of moderating contemporary lifestyle.
Yeah.
Well, there's
Or
certainly a lot
I
of
would say
certainly a lot of things in our Western culture that need to be moderated.
yeah.
So
with a lot of people falling quote unquote victim to that.
Yeah.
Day-to-day issues of
People talk about it as a way of moderating that.
Would you like to say something? You haven't said anything.
I don't really have anything to say. It is, I don't know. It's just interesting. I just like listening to it.
There was just a short story that one of the companions of Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam, after he died, and there was Abu Bakr 2 years, Omar 10 years, Uthman 13 years, and Ali 5 years, and then Muawiyah took over for 20 years. So one of the companions visited him, and he saw the extravagance around himself. So he told him that verse, those who accumulate. He said, Muawiyah said to him, no, it's only for the Jews and the Christians.
Oh. So it didn't take long to.
He told him, no, it was not advised. It's told to everybody, not only Jews or Christians, and Muslims too. And you are one of them.
Yeah.
And at that time, he became upset with him. I think that was the time of Osman. And Osman radiallahu anhu asked him, he told him, you don't visit Damascus anymore in order to see how much money Muawiyah has. Muawiyah at that time was one of the governors.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, of Muslims, but he was one of the cousins of Osman. So Osman said his cousin should not be treated this way. So he told him, don't visit him anymore.
Well, it's certainly high, maybe highest on the list of the things that Muslims and Christians should do. But it's difficult for me to imagine how we can convince other people easily to do it. We talk about it, and we should talk about it. We preach about it. But nevertheless, God makes it happen. And maybe that's, as long as we are keeping the issue out in our sermons, and are talking to our families, maybe that's all we can do, and then God will take care of the rest. I can visualize, even now, I can visualize presidents of countries and presidents of corporations having this kind of spiritual simplicity. I don't know of any.
Nobody really.
I can just visualize it.
You shouldn't fight those. He's wearing a
I
Rolex.
don't know. I just keep hoping that that will happen, and maybe the time is not yet, but hopefully God has that in His plan.
But I still feel comfortable that I hear lots about soup kitchens in the churches here, helping people, which is not government, it's private. That means there are lots of good Christians who really pay to the church, so take care of the poor in them, which is great. It's
and they certainly are motivated by this a simple spirituality. But it is not inconsistent, as we've said, with being being rich or in a powerful position.
Yeah,
it's just rare. Yeah.
One company that I know of that has that approach is Thrivent.
Oh, yeah.
That's an insurance company. It started out Thrivent for Lutherans, but then it became Thrivent for Christians. But they practice that. They
Used
the
to be Lutheran
CEO
Brotherhood. Pardon? Used to be Lutheran Brotherhood.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. He keeps his salary way down, and
I didn't
they
know
do
that.
other good things that they try to encourage. You know, you can apply to them if you want to do some kind of a project or whatever, and they will give you money to do that project. And so they
So
try to practice that.
Do you know the name of the CEO?
I don't.
Because for many years, Rolf Bjelland was the CEO, and he is a fraternity brother of mine. That's really surprising that I would learn that, but that's good news.
I think we are at a time in history or in our culture where the tide might be turning, because even outside of the church and outside of the Ummah and everything, I think you see, the idea of living simply, it's catching on in other areas, even like agnostic or atheist areas, right? Having a low carbon footprint is a big topic, which coincides with living simply for different reasons. But, and then the idea of slowing down and focusing and meditating more, like in secular circles, they use the phrase mindfulness, which is basically meditation without God. Probably not as effective, but better than nothing, I guess. But so I think that people are seeing now in our culture, I mean, we've gotten to a point where there is just so much coming at you, so much like just entertainment and distraction, that there is a need to pull away, like just for your own mental health. We have so many people with mental health issues now. And I think as far as materialism and accumulation not making people happy, I mean, I think it's never been easier to accumulate. If I'm rich, I can accumulate gold and go on trips to the Mediterranean, but even if I'm poor, I can go and just spend my days drinking at the bar or something. You know, there are cheaper ways to entertain myself, and so I think that we're at a point now where it's never been easier to just be completely distracted and materialistic, and I think we're seeing it's bad for society. I think all religions and people without religions are seeing it.
But you're saying that people are, and I've seen it too, people are reacting to this materialism on their own. I mean, just kind of out of the blue, out of the woodwork, and becoming vegetarians and vegans and ethical vegetarians, not wanting to harm animals, and all these other things you mentioned. They're doing it on their own, but it's not really on their own. I think God is telling them to do it. I think this is a movement of God.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Also a movement devoid of God.
Well, they
Devoid of God.
they are mostly, they are not religious people.
It's part of what they're terming atheism 2.0.
Yeah,
But maybe it's a pathway to getting to the point where they suddenly realize it could be.
I'd like to think that it would be. I mean, because if it's some area that you're taking this interest in, then potentially then you have Christians or Muslims, you know, or Buddhists, different religious groups saying like, oh yeah, we knew that was important already. We've been trying to tell you for, you know, thousands of years.
We've been talking about different religions, but let's not forget Hinduism. There's a great deal of asceticism of the kind we've been discussing in Hinduism.
I need to get going. You guys,
Are you going to have Thanksgiving dinner with it?
no. Yeah,
Because it's free.
I know. Unfortunately, I can't though.
Oh,
I have another meeting to get to. So.
okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again. It's 4 o'clock according to that clock. So
Yeah, so we meet, once we finish, we can start going to Big Marina.
yes,
And when you go in, you just tell them ICM Interfaith.
right.
And we'll catch up with you. We'll have to pray Asr
Yeah.
before we...
So Naeem, are you going to be able to join us at Big Marina?
Yeah, I think I will.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's nice.
Nice. And Steve, are you going to drive up